If you find it difficult to score high on the TOEFL test because of the challenging topics it covers, keep watching this video. Many students struggle to achieve a good listening or reading score because they don't recognize key academic words used in the test. While you don't need to understand every single word, knowing certain terms will make it much easier to tackle both sections with confidence. If you're currently preparing for the test, you can find all the important vocabulary organized into Quizlet sets in our TOEFL course by clicking the link below. Today, we'll have a very practical lesson. First, we'll discuss essential agriculture vocabulary. Then, we'll analyze one TOEFL reading passage, followed by 2 academic lectures, all on the topic of agriculture. This method will not only help you expand your vocabulary, but also improve both your listening and reading comprehension. And I'll also share useful tips and strategies for both sections. And since you'll encounter these words multiple times in context, your brain will recognize them as essential tools for TOEFL success, rather than just random words on a list. As always, let me know in the comments which words were new for you and how many answers you got right in both the reading and listening sections. Let's dive in. The first part of this video is, of course, the vocabulary. If you're already familiar with most of these words, feel free to skip this part and jump straight to the reading passage. Let's look at the top agriculture-related words you should know, grouped by theme. The first 3 words on our list are agriculture, agricultural practices, and agricultural techniques. Agriculture is a vast field that involves cultivating plants, raising animals, and managing land to produce food and other resources. Agricultural practices are the methods and activities used in farming, like planting, harvesting, and caring for crops and animals. Agricultural techniques refer to the specific methods or tools used to improve farming, such as irrigation, crop rotation, or advanced machinery. Agricultural practices and techniques. Word number 4, and the first agricultural practice is sowing. This means planting seeds in the soil so they can grow into plants. For example, a farmer sows wheat seeds in a field in the spring to harvest wheat in the summer. Word number 5 is weeding. We all know that weeds are wild plants that grow where they're not wanted and compete with cultivated plants. We need to remove them. So weeding is when we remove unwanted plants that grow among crops and take nutrients from the soil. Farmers often pull weeds out by hand or with tools to ensure their crops grow well. Word number 6 is plowing. Plowing means turning over the soil to make it loose and ready for planting seeds. Farmers use plows attached to tractors or animals, like oxen, to prepare their fields. Another interesting word is to cultivate. It means to prepare and use land for crops or gardening. There is also a noun, cultivation. Cultivation is the process of preparing and working on the land to grow crops. Cultivation includes activities like plowing, sowing, and irrigating the soil so that it can grow healthy plants. I've just mentioned the word irrigating. What does that mean? This is our 8th word. To irrigate means to supply land with water so that crops and plants will grow or grow better. Irrigation is the process of watering. There are many irrigation techniques that are used in agriculture. Irrigation techniques are methods used to supply water to crops when there isn't enough rain. Sprinklers, canals, and drip systems are examples of irrigation that farmers use to keep their plants healthy. Number 9 is strip farming. It's a method where crops are planted in alternating strips to protect the soil from erosion. For example, a farmer might grow corn in one strip and grass in another. That's called strip farming. This technique has many benefits, such as reduced diseases, less need for pesticides, and increased biodiversity. Another important point is understanding the types of questions for each section and knowing how to approach them effectively. Often, students can understand most of the text in the reading section, but still end up with a score of 22 to 23. Some may know almost every word in the listening section, but get fluctuating scores ranging from 21 to 28. To score consistently high, you need to know exactly what to do in each question type and how to get to the right answers as quickly as possible. In our TOEFL prep course, we'll go over reading passages together, review strategies for the listening section, share high-scoring templates for writing and speaking, and more. You can find the link to the course below. If you want feedback on your writing and speaking, consider the Pro package, but be sure to schedule the consultation at least a week before the test, so you have time to apply the corrections I will suggest. Another type of farming, and our 10th word, is crop rotation. It's the practice of planting different crops sequentially on the same plot of land to improve soil health, optimize nutrients in the soil, and combat pests and weed presence. Rotating crops each year, for example, helps keep the soil healthy. I suggest you pause here for a second and look at the words you've just written down. Think about how they can be used in texts about agriculture. Try making some sample sentences with them. Let's do a small challenge now. Take the 10 words we've just covered and create a super long sentence that uses all 10 of them, but still makes sense. Share it in the comments below, and we'll see who created the most interesting sentence. This is great practice to help you remember the new words better. Another effective way to retain new vocabulary is to do reading and listening practice tests. You can find these on the LinguaTOEFL platform. They also have an app, so if you're an app lover, you might find it even more convenient. For those interested in speaking and writing practice, you can also get your speaking and writing assessed by AI. My advice is to study new words from one topic, let's say agriculture, and then find a text or a lecture on the same topic to see if they help you understand more and answer correctly. Now that we've given your brain some time to rest, let's move on. Word number 11 is sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture is all about farming practices designed to protect the environment and produce food for the long term. For example, the two techniques I've just mentioned, like crop rotation and strip farming, are examples of sustainable agriculture. Word number 12 is terrace farming, or terracing. This is an agricultural practice where farmlands are rearranged, or hills are turned into farmland by constructing specific ridged platforms. On TOEFL, you might also see the idea of terraced lands. These are steps carved into hillsides to create flat areas for farming. You've probably seen pictures of terraced lands before, like rice terraces in the Philippines. Because they're flat, they allow farmers to grow crops on steep land without the soil washing away. Word number 13 is windbreaks. Windbreaks, just as the name suggests, are rows of trees or bushes planted around fields to block strong winds that could damage crops. These also help keep the soil from blowing away. All these techniques help us to maintain or preserve land. This is our next word. To preserve something means to maintain it in its original or existing state. When we preserve land, we take steps to protect it so it can stay fertile and productive. For example, farmers might use cover crops to prevent soil from eroding during the off-season. Our next block is about natural land types. On TOEFL, you'll often see words related to land types. So let's look at the most common examples. We have prairies, large, flat, or gently rolling grasslands with few trees, often found in North America. These areas are great for growing wheat and raising cattle. Rainforests, dense forests in tropical regions with heavy rainfall throughout the year. The Amazon rainforest, for example, is home to many unique plants and animals. Savannas, open grasslands with scattered trees, usually found in tropical regions like Africa. They are often used for grazing livestock, like cows and goats. Wetlands. Areas where the land is covered with water, like marshes and swamps. Wetlands are important for wildlife and are sometimes used to grow crops like rice. Grasslands. Regions dominated by grasses rather than trees. Examples include the veld in South Africa, which is used for grazing animals. Hilly regions are areas with many small hills that can make farming difficult. Farmers in these areas often use terraced lands to grow crops. Finally, the last term in today's lesson is terraced lands. As you probably know, terraced lands are flat, steep-like surfaces that are carved into hillsides and mountainsides. This method is often used in areas with steep terrain to create flat areas for farming. The process helps to prevent soil erosion, manage water flow, and make it possible to grow crops in otherwise challenging environments. You can find terraced lands in places like the Andes in South America, where farmers use the terraces to grow crops like potatoes, maize, and quinoa. It's a clever and sustainable way of farming in areas where flat land is scarce. Crops and grains. The first word is probably one of the most popular in the topic of agriculture. You'll see it all the time. So let's begin with it. Crops are plants grown by farmers for food or other uses. Common examples include wheat, corn, and rice. 2. In TOEFL reading passages, you'll often come across mentions of seeds. A seed is a part of a plant that can grow in a new plant when placed in soil. For instance, sunflower seeds can be planted to grow new sunflower plants. Seeds are the starting point for growing plants, and they play a crucial role in agriculture. When farmers plant seeds in the soil, they grow into crops. When it comes to seeds, a useful verb to know is to germinate. This is our third word. Germination is when a seed starts to sprout and grow into a plant. For example, when a bean seed is watered and kept warm, it will germinate in a few days. Crops are usually connected to the notions of yields and harvests. Let's explain the difference between harvest, yield, and crops. Crops refer to plants grown by farmers. Harvest is the process of collecting crops when they're fully grown. For example, farmers harvest wheat in the summer by cutting it down and gathering the grain. Yield is the amount of harvest produced from a piece of land. For instance, a high yield means a large amount, while a low yield means less. So the fourth and fifth words on our list today are yield and harvest. Another important phrase is palatable grains. Just recently, I saw it in one of the TOEFL reading passages. Palatable grains are grains that are suitable and tasty for eating, such as wheat, oats, and barley. These grains are used in making bread, soups, and other foods. The last word in this section is food surplus. This refers to extra food produced during a good harvest. The surplus can be stored for future use or sold. An important thing to keep in mind is that no matter how many words you know, if your strategy is incorrect, getting a high score will be extremely difficult. On the other hand, if you know how to approach each question correctly, you might score high even if some words are unfamiliar. We explain all the approaches and strategies in our TOEFL course. We have an entire course dedicated to TOEFL preparation, where we teach you all the words you need to know to consistently score high on every section of the test. You'll get topic-based vocabulary lists. You can study daily on Quizlet, high-scoring templates for speaking and writing, strategies for each question type, and more. You'll also get free access to the LinguaTOEFL platform, where you can take practice tests that simulate the real exam, drill different reading question types, get your speaking and writing responses scored, and build your vocabulary through interactive quizzes. Plus, you'll receive a 5% discount on your TOEFL test when you use our promo code. I'll leave the link below. Click on it to check out the program and join our TOEFL community. In my opinion, the best recipe for success is study the topic-specific vocabulary, to get familiar with the subjects. And at the same time, start doing reading and listening tests. Then, study the strategies for each question type and do more tests. Compare your results. You should see an improvement of at least 3 to 4 points. After that, continue doing tests, analyzing your performance each time. What you did wrong, where you made mistakes, and how you could have avoided them. Feel free to share your results and experiences in the comments below. The next block on our agenda involves climate and environmental factors. The first word in this block is rainfall. It's the amount of rain that falls in an area. Crops like rice need a lot of rainfall, while others, like wheat, can grow with less. The next word is precipitation. Precipitation is water that falls from the sky in any form, like rain, snow, or sleet. You'll see this word a lot on the TOEFL test, so make sure to write it down. Moisture, the amount of water in the soil, air, or plants. Too much or too little moisture can affect crop growth. Drought, a long period without rain, which can make it hard for crops to grow. For example, a drought in a farming area can lead to food shortages. Arid climate, a dry environment with very little rainfall. Farmers in arid climates often use irrigation to grow crops. The next section is all about livestock and domesticated animals. The most important word in this section is cattle. Cattle refers to large farm animals, including cows, sheep, goats, and oxen. One more word you'll see a lot on the TOEFL test is domesticated animals. These are animals that are kept for work, food, or wool. Examples of domesticated animals include horses, chickens, and sheep. Finally, livestock. Livestock refers to domesticated animals raised for farming purposes, such as buffalo and camels. Now, what about tools and equipment that are used in agriculture? They are granaries, storage buildings used to keep grains like wheat and corn safe from pests and moisture. Barns, buildings used to store hay. Equipment, or crops, and to provide shelter for livestock, especially during rain or harsh weather. As I just said, barns can serve as shelters for domesticated animals. And our next word is shelter. A shelter is a structure or space that protects animals or people from weather conditions like rain, heat, or cold. Grinding stones, tools used to crush grains into flour. For instance, traditional communities often use grinding stones to make bread from wheat. You'll see this word quite often in TOEFL reading passages and lectures. Axe and adze, tools used for cutting and shaping wood. Farmers might use them to build shelters or repair fences. Cisterns are large containers used to store water for irrigation or drinking. Farmers often rely on cisterns in dry regions to ensure a steady water supply. Last but not least comes the block about pests and soil management. The key word in this section is, of course, the first one, pests. Pests are insects or animals that damage crops. They usually eat plants and reduce harvests. 2. Pesticides. Chemicals used to control pests and protect crops. Farmers spray pesticides on their fields to prevent insect infestations. 25. Soil. The top layer of earth where plants grow. Healthy soil is full of nutrients that help crops grow well. Now, topsoil is the uppermost layer of soil, which is the most fertile and important for farming. Losing topsoil due to erosion can hurt crop production. This brings us to our final phrase, soil deterioration. Soil deterioration is a process where soil loses its nutrients and becomes less useful for growing crops. This often happens because of overuse or poor management. It makes farming harder, but farmers can prevent it by rotating crops or adding nutrients back to the soil. This is why sustainable agriculture is so important these days. Now that we've covered the essential vocabulary, let's move on to our reading passage. For each question, pause the video and try to answer it yourself first. Then keep watching to compare your strategy with mine. We're going to analyze a TOEFL reading passage and check whether you know all the strategies and techniques needed to tackle TOEFL reading. So if you find this section of the test difficult or can't get the score you need, keep watching. If you want to increase your score in a quick and effective way, click the link below to join our TOEFL course. Today's text is about Southwest agriculture. On test day, there will be 10 questions for each passage. But for this practice, we'll have 13 questions. That's because there are going to be a few more vocabulary questions than usual, which is a great addition for us. Let's dive in. The first question is the vocabulary question. It says, the word eventually in the passage is closest in meaning to. Then you need to choose which of the 4 options is the most similar in meaning. Eventually means in the end. So option C is the correct answer. This word is very common in TOEFL reading passages, and you'll come across it frequently. So in case you don't know it, make sure to write it down. Now, question 2 is the inference question. It says, paragraph 1 supports which of the following inferences about the North American Southwest? For inference questions, you need to read the paragraph and draw a conclusion based on it. In this question, I need to make an inference about the North American Southwest. Since the paragraph isn't very long, I would read it first. If the paragraph is longer, you can quickly skim the answer options before reading it. As I read, I try to break the text into a few short and easy to understand ideas. Pause the video now to try answering on your own first, then watch my explanation. I see that hunter-gatherers arrived, and after their arrival, several types of agriculture emerged. Emerged means appeared. Again, if you don't know this word, be sure to write it down. These types of agriculture addressed one main problem: the Southwest's fundamental problem. Fundamental means main. The problem was how to obtain enough water to grow crops. Why was it a problem? Because the environment isn't ideal for agriculture, as rainfall is low and unpredictable. As a result, little or no farming is practiced there today. Then, we see that people experimented with alternative strategies in different locations for a long time. And many of these experiments were successful for centuries. But eventually, all of them succumbed to environmental problems. What is the meaning of the word succumb? To succumb means to fail to resist pressure, to give in, or to be overwhelmed by a negative force. So basically, they all failed, except one. Let's look at the answer options. A. Its sources of water were plentiful when the hunter-gatherers first arrived. No, we just read that their main problem was how to obtain enough water to grow crops. B. It has always lacked the large population needed to perform successful experiments in agriculture. There is no mention of the population, so B is incorrect. C. Its climatic conditions today are essentially similar to those existing when the hunter-gatherers first arrived. Now, the paragraph says, all involving different solutions to the Southwest's fundamental problem. Fundamental problem: how to obtain enough water to grow crops in an environment where rainfall is so low and unpredictable that little or no farming is practiced there today. This shows that the climatic conditions now are similar to those when the hunter-gatherers first arrived. So C is the correct answer. Now D, it was more seriously affected by climate change than it was by human impact, is incorrect. There is no comparison made between climate change and human impact. The paragraph only mentions human impact or climate change at the end, but doesn't compare them. So C is the correct answer. If you start by reading the answer options, then read the text, then go back to the answer options, you'll waste a lot of time. Also, if you focus too much on the keywords, you might miss option C because it doesn't contain enough keywords from the text. So for this question, focus on the ideas, not the keywords. Now, question 3 is the negative factual information question. It's the one where you see the word except, which means you need to find the option that is not correct based on the text. The question says, all of the following are mentioned in paragraph 2 as potential problems faced by the Hohokam except. Now, for this question, I suggest you read the answer options first. A. Insufficient rainfall to allow crops to grow. B. Rainstorms leading to destructive water runoff. C. Insufficient workers to dig ditches and canals. And D. Irrigation water levels in channels too low to be used. So we have insufficient rainfall, rainstorms, insufficient workers, irrigation water levels that are too low. Now, with these options in mind, I go back to the text and look for the potential problems faced by the Hohokam. I can see that one strategy was to live at higher elevations, where rainfall was higher. But that carried a risk because higher elevations are cooler than lower elevations. And in an especially cool year, it might be too cold to grow crops at all. An opposite extreme was to farm at the warmer, low elevations. But there the rainfall is insufficient, even for dry land agriculture. The Hohokam got around that problem by constructing the most extreme irrigation system in the Americas outside Peru. But irrigation entailed the risk that human digging of ditches and canals could lead to sudden heavy water runoff from rainstorms, digging further down into the ditches and canals, and carving out deep channels. So in that case, the water level would drop below the field level, making irrigation impossible for people without pumps. Now let's check the answer choices. A. Insufficient rainfall to allow crops to grow. Mentioned in the middle of the paragraph. The text says, the rainfall is insufficient even for dry land agriculture. B. Rainstorms leading to destructive water runoff. Mentioned closer to the end of the paragraph. Irrigation entails the risk that human digging of ditches and canals could lead to sudden heavy water runoff from rainstorms, which means that rainstorms could lead to destructive water runoff. D. Irrigation water levels in channels too low to be used. Mentioned in the last sentence. The water level would drop below the field level, making irrigation impossible for people without pumps. But what about option C? Insufficient workers to dig ditches and canals. Now, this sentence contains many keywords from the paragraph, but it's actually incorrect, which makes it the correct answer. Why? We do have a mention of workers digging ditches and canals, but there is no indication that there were not enough of them. So C is the answer. Always remember that the correct answer is the one that is incorrect based on the text. Great job. The next question is another vocabulary question. It's about the word initially. We know that initially means at first. So A, first, is correct. Let's move on to question 5. It's one more vocabulary question. I love these practice tests because they provide more questions, especially more vocabulary questions, which is great for testing your vocabulary. By the way, in case you've been wondering, this test comes from the Wakeshoe website. If you prefer apps or find the Chinese on the Wakeshoe website a bit confusing, you can practice with the LinguaTOEFL app. There, you can select the question types that are most challenging for you and focus on them until you master them. Then move on to the practice tests. Now back to the question. The word adjacent in the passage is closest in meaning to neighboring, higher, unused, additional. An adjacent room is the room next door. So adjacent refers to something that is neighboring. That's why A is correct. If you don't know this word, be sure to write it down because once again, it's very helpful for the TOEFL test. Also, feel free to check out these videos I've made with the most common vocabulary for the TOEFL test. Now, question number 6 is the factual information question. It asks us, according to paragraph 3, which of the following was the cause of the collapse of the member society? For this question, we need to find the key words, which are collapse and member society, and analyze what the question is asking. We need to identify the cause of the collapse. Then, we'll locate the right sentence or two in the paragraph based on the keywords we've identified. Some students might see the first mention of the member society, go straight to it and start reading. However, they will most likely need to read the whole text. And while there is nothing wrong with that, it will waste a lot of time. This means they'll probably end up running out of time by the end of the text. So remember, for this question type, the factual information question, you always want to find one or at most 2 sentences, no more than that. In this case, I see that the member society is mentioned 3 times. Once at the beginning, once in the middle, and once closer to the end of the paragraph. If I check the mention at the end, I see that it also includes the word collapse. In the question, we have the noun, collapse, and in the text, we have the verb, to collapse. So I'm going to read this sentence and give it a try. However, when drought conditions returned, that gamble left them with a population double what the floodplain could support, and the member society collapsed suddenly under the stress. This means that when the dry period returned, they could not support their population because it was too large. As a result, the society collapsed. Now, keeping this information in mind, I go back to the answer options. As I scan them, I see that D is the correct answer. Their population became too large to survive when the climate entered the dry period. That's it. You don't need to read the whole paragraph. As you can see, answering TOEFL reading questions isn't just about your English level. It's also largely about how well you know the strategies and how quickly you can apply and adjust them. This makes up about 60 or 70% of your success. Together with academic vocabulary and sufficient practice, that's all you need to know to score 30 out of 30. If you want to learn how to effectively apply all the strategies in the reading section and do so easily and effortlessly without wasting time, click on the link below and enroll in our TOEFL preparation course. We'll guide you through each strategy step by step, and we'll work through many reading passages together, where I'll show you exactly how to apply the strategies you've learned. In my one-on-one sessions, I've noticed that the majority of students know the strategies, but they struggle to adapt and apply them to the right questions, especially under time pressure. This is why it's so important not only to study the strategies, but also to practice them repeatedly to ensure you're applying them correctly. Doing so will save you a lot of time on test day and help you score 25 plus in the reading section. The link is below. Our next question is another factual information question. Again, the strategy is exactly the same. Read the question first, then locate the relevant part of the text. Read it and find the correct answer. The question says, according to paragraph 4, the solution of moving to other previously occupied areas was effective only when. So what we need to find in the text is when and only when the solution of moving to other previously occupied areas was effective. I go to the text and see the word solution mentioned right at the very beginning. The text says, still, another solution was to occupy an area only for a few decades. A decade is a period of 10 years, until the area's soil became exhausted, then to move to another area. But when was it effective? I keep reading and I see that method worked when people were living at low population densities, when there were many unoccupied areas to move to, and when each occupied area could be left unoccupied again for sufficiently long after occupation, so its vegetation and soil nutrients had time to recover. So basically, what they're saying here is that this method was effective when the population wasn't very dense. As a result, there were many unoccupied areas people could move to, and the previously occupied areas could be left empty for a while, allowing the vegetation and soil nutrients to recover. Keeping this information in mind, I go back to the answer options. As I read them, you can pause the video now to find the correct answer yourself first. I immediately see the B is correct. The vegetation and nutrients of the previously occupied area had time to recover. That's exactly what we read in the passage. For factual information questions, I always suggest reading the relevant part of the text first, so you can formulate the answer in your own words. That way, when you check the answer choices, finding the right one becomes a piece of cake. Let's move on to the next question. We have another negative factual information question. The solution for unpredictable rainfall described in paragraph 5 involved all of the following except. Let's read the answer options. Planting crops in many different places, regardless of predicted rainfall. Using a simple political and social system for the coordination of agricultural activities. Harvesting crops from those sites that did receive adequate rain. Sharing harvested crops with people whose crops did not grow well. To make these options easier to remember, let's simplify them. Planting crops in many places. Using a simple system to coordinate agricultural activities. Harvesting crops from places that got enough rain. And sharing crops with those who had bad harvests. You always want to simplify the answer choices so you don't forget them. Now let's look at the paragraph. As we read the text, we see that one more strategy was to plant crops at many sites even though rainfall was locally unpredictable. That matches option A, planting crops in many places. Eliminate it. And then to harvest crops at whichever sites did get enough rain to produce a good harvest. This matches option C, harvesting crops from places that got enough rain. Again, eliminate it. And to redistribute some of the harvest to the people still living at all the sites that did not happen to receive enough rain that year. This matches option D, sharing crops with those who had bad harvests. Eliminate it. So A, C, and D are all mentioned in the text. Now let's look at option B. B says, using a simple political and social system for the coordination of agricultural activities. But the text says, redistribution was not without risks. because it involved a complex political and social system to integrate activities between different sides. The text says complex, while option B says simple. That's a contradiction, which means sentence B is incorrect, according to the passage. So the correct answer is B. Let's move on. Next is the vocabulary question. To depend on someone means to rely on someone. So C, reliable, is the right answer. Question 10. Which of the following contributed to the success of the strategy discussed in paragraph 6? Simply put, why did the strategy become effective? Let's start reading. The remaining strategy was to plant crops and live near permanent or dependable sources of water, but on landscape benches above the main floodways, so as to avoid the risk of a heavy flood washing out fields and villages, and to practice a diverse economy, exploiting ecologically diverse zones so that each settlement would be self-sufficient. That solution, adopted by people whose descendants live today in the Southwest's Hopi and Zuni villages, has succeeded for more than 1,000 years. So, the strategy succeeded. Why did it succeed? Because for one, they were planting crops and living near permanent or dependable sources of water. But at the same time, they were above the main floodways, so a heavy flood could not wash out their fields or villages. And one more reason they became successful was that they practiced a diverse economy. Now let's look at the answer options. Crops were planted high enough to avoid being carried away by floods. The text says, but on landscape benches above the main floodways, so as to avoid the risk of a heavy flood washing out fields and villages. So option A is the correct answer. You can also read the rest of the options to double check that none of them work for this paragraph. Question 11. Which of the following best describes the organization of the passage? This is a very good question because it asks us to look at the whole text and analyze how it is structured. To answer this question, you want to quickly skim through each paragraph and recall its main idea. It might seem challenging, but remember, you've already answered all the previous questions, so you have a solid understanding of the text. Besides, you don't need to read everything. Usually, just the beginning of each paragraph is enough. If you remember, the first paragraph was all about trying to find different strategies to solve the fundamental problem: how to obtain enough water to grow crops in an environment where rainfall was low. Let's look at how each of the following paragraphs begins. One strategy was, a more conservative strategy was, still another solution was, one more strategy was, the remaining strategy was. Basically, the text first describes a major problem, the lack of water for crops, and then lists several strategies to solve it. If we check the answer options, we can see the D, a description of a long-standing problem faced by the people in Southwest North America, followed by a discussion of strategies that have been used to overcome this problem, is the right answer. The next question is my favorite, the insert text question. This question is fairly easy, yet many students struggle with it because they use the wrong approach. What we need to do is look at the four squares and figure out where the given sentence can be added in the passage. The sentence is, another risk of irrigation was that floods could simply wash away the dams and channels, as indeed may have happened eventually to the Hohokam. The sentence mentions another risk of irrigation, which means that before we introduce it, we need to mention the first risk of irrigation. It also talks about floods. We don't have any pronouns to help us here, but the phrase another risk will allow us to find the right answer. Now, look at the sentence that begins with, but irrigation entailed the risk. It introduces the first risk, which, if you remember from earlier, was about the heavy water runoff. This means that our sentence should come after this when. It can either go in square C or square D. Let's check option C. It says, in that case, the water level would drop below the level of the field. This phrase refers to the first risk, so option C doesn't work either. That leaves us with option D. Here is the structure of the paragraph. First, we mentioned the opposite extreme. Then we explain how the Hohokam got around the problem. Then the first risk is introduced, the heavy water runoff. The text then explains what would happen in this case. Finally, we introduce one more risk. The flood could wash away the dams and channels. So D is the right answer. Finally, the last question is the summary question. Here you need to choose 3 sentences that summarize the main idea of the text. The introductory sentence is, people trying to grow crops in the dry southwestern area of North America experimented with various strategies for almost 1,000 years. Now we just need to choose 3 options that represent the main ideas of the paragraphs. What's the easiest way to tackle this question? First, you can quickly skim through the reading passage again and identify the main ideas of each paragraph. Then try to match those ideas with the answer choices. Remember, if an answer choice summarizes ideas from 2 or even 3 paragraphs, it's most likely correct. Another tip is to go through the options and eliminate those that are just supporting points or minor details. Also, never pick 2 options that refer to the same paragraph. Each correct answer should represent a particular part of the passage. Pause the video now and try to choose the correct answers. The correct answers are C, D, and F. Great job! Finally, part 3 of today's lesson is listening practice. You'll now listen to 2 academic lectures on agriculture, and we'll analyze the questions after each one. Make sure to structure your notes clearly, as TOEFL questions are based on specific sections of the lecture. If you struggle with note-taking or feel like it slows you down, check out our TOEFL course, where we break down lectures and conversations and show you exactly what to include in your notes. Also, if you like this format, we have a similar video where I talk about zoology vocabulary first and then analyze 2 lectures. Feel free to check it out. I personally find these types of videos very helpful, so I'm planning to release more on other topics as well. You can subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon not to miss them. Today we'll go through 2 full lectures on the topic of agriculture. Let's get started. Lecture 1.
Listen to part of a university lecture on agriculture. Good afternoon, class. We've been looking at various scenarios of the world's population problems and their possible solutions over our last few classes. And today I'd like us to take a quick look at one of the solutions to the growing problem of supplying enough food for us all. It's called dry land farming. Dry land farming is a set of agricultural practices, agricultural techniques that should be, or need to be, used to produce profitable crops in areas where the rainfall or the snowfall is slight, is erratic, or is very seasonal, and is generally less than about 50 centimeters a year. All over the world, there are countries that must use these less than optimal lands to grow their food. The North American prairies, the South American pampas, the Russian steppes, the Middle East. All of these areas have marginal rainfall precipitation. Almost half of India's arable cultivatable land, 47 out of a total of 108 million hectares, is dry land, as opposed to land fed by adequate rainfall. Originally, these lands were covered with well-adapted grasses, but today, much of the natural cover is gone, and these vast plains are seen as, potentially at least, our global breadbasket. Now, dryland farming is something that must be practiced in places where the land is inherently only barely suited for food production in the first place. And you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. But there are a number of things you can do that can improve the situation, the conditions for successful farming. Water is of course a key, or the key requirement, and the little participation that does fall must be captured and conserved and used sparingly. Providing windbreaks and providing some light shade and leaving residues from previous crops can often save water, keep it from evaporating so quickly. And weeding can save the water that weeds would otherwise drink up. If the countryside is hilly, terracing can be used, and this goes along with contour plowing to prevent runoff. In some areas, it may even be feasible to build cisterns so that rainwater can be collected and stored. Also, planting the seeds carefully, with consideration, choosing precisely the right time to plant them, choosing the optimum seed depth, and so forth, can help use the available moisture efficiently. Mentioning seeds brings me to the next point, crop choice. Drought-resistant varieties, heat-tolerant varieties, of wheat or corn for instance, must be chosen or developed. Varieties that can stand hot, dry conditions, whose seeds will germinate in such adverse conditions, and which have growth cycles, life cycles, that are fitted to the conditions they must face. With careful attention to these choices and to these practices we're talking about here, even crops like watermelons have been grown successfully in dry lands. So, conserving and carefully distributing what rainfall is available and choosing crops that can best tolerate dry conditions are key factors for success. And the soil itself is also a key factor. Dryland soils are, as you might expect, relatively poor in nutrients because dry conditions allow a lot of topsoil to be blown away. So the quality of the thin topsoils must be preserved and maintained as carefully as possible. The most obvious help here is fertilizers, but other techniques like mulching, putting a protective cover over the field like old vegetable matter, plant stalks and leaves for instance, or plastic sheeting, and minimal tillage, minimal plowing help solve this problem of soil deterioration, as well as the other main soil problem, erosion. Erosion can also be fought with windbreaks and strip farming, which is the planting of alternate strips of land each growing season. As I said before, dry lands by their nature are not very good, relatively speaking, for growing our food, and part of that is that they are more susceptible to low crop yields or complete crop failures. This is something that dryland farmers must always keep in mind and must always plan for, be ready to deal with. If the year turns ugly, if it is even drier and colder or hotter than usual, the farmer must be ready and willing to abandon his effort for that year, and in that way to save his fertilizers and his seeds and his energies. On the other hand, in promising years, where the weather is boding fair, the farmer should be quick to take advantage of it by boosting yields with extra or broader plantings, by extending his growing cycle and so on, and of course by working longer and harder at it. With such approaches as these and others we develop, the productivity of such marginal dry lands may be able to help us keep up with our irresistible growing populations. We can at least take hope in the thought that the natives of the arid American Southwest, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Navajo, survived for hundreds of years on dryland farming in an area with rainfall of less than 25 centimeters a year.
Question 1. How has the professor organized his lecture? The correct answer is D, by key elements. At the very beginning of the lecture, the professor says that we're going to talk about one of the solutions to the growing problem of providing enough food for all of us. He says the name of this solution is dry land farming. It's a set of agricultural techniques. It's usually used in places where the land is not suitable for food production. And then the professor starts talking about the key elements of dry land farming, such as water conservation, crop selection, soil quality, and the risks associated with unpredictable weather. That's his way of organizing the lecture. Question 2. The professor mentions watermelons as an example of what? The correct answer is C, an unusual success. When the professor starts talking about choosing crops, he says that the only special kinds of seeds should be chosen. They should be drought-resistant, heat-tolerant, and so on. If you pay attention to the choice of seeds and plan carefully, even crops like watermelons can be successfully grown in dry areas. This tells us that it's not easy to grow watermelons in hot conditions, so it's an unusual success to be able to grow one. 3. According to the lecture, which is not true of dry land agriculture. Answer B is correct. It's practiced in half of Russia's arable lands. In the lecture, the professor mentioned Russia as one of the countries that must use less than optimal lands. But first, he never mentioned whether or not dry land agriculture is already practiced in Russia. And second, he talks about the Russian steppes and never says whether they make up half of Russia's arable lands. As for other statements, they are true. Dry land farming is a collection of methods, requires water, and faces erratic productivity. Question 4. What is one of the main challenges of dry land farming? The soil loses nutrients and is easily eroded. A is the correct answer. The professor explains that dry land soils tend to be poor in nutrients because the dry conditions allow the topsoil, the most fertile layer of soil, to be blown away by the wind. The process is called wind erosion, and it makes farming even more difficult by removing valuable nutrients from the soil. Question 5. What does the professor suggest farmers should do in years with very little rainfall? Answer B. Abandon farming for that year to save resources. The professor explains that farming in dry lands is unpredictable. Some years may be better than others, but in extremely dry years, farmers have to make a difficult decision. Instead of planting and risking a failed crop, they should be prepared to abandon farming for that season. This way, they can save important resources like seeds, fertilizers, and energy for a better year. On the other hand, when the weather conditions are good, farmers should take advantage by planting more and working harder to increase their harvest. Great! We've finished the first lecture. Unlike this one, some lectures and the questions after them can be very tricky, but with the right note-taking skills, you can answer every question correctly. In fact, note-taking is one of the most important skills for succeeding in the TOEFL listening section. It's not always easy though. Some students don't take enough notes and miss key points that would help with the answers, while others try to write down everything and end up losing sight of the main idea. If you want to master note-taking once and for all, join our TOEFL course. We'll not only practice with mock tests, but also go over both lecture and conversation scripts to highlight what's important to write down. I'll teach you key strategies for the listening section that will make answering questions easier, and we'll cover important vocabulary like campus-related terms that will help you in the listening, speaking, and writing sections. If you're struggling to get the score you want in the listening section or overall, click the link below to sign up. Let's move on to the second lecture.
Listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
So we've been talking about early civilizations, those that existed 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. And today I'd like to talk about the switch from foraging, or searching for whatever wild foods are available, to farming, intentionally cultivating crops. Now, the way that switch is frequently portrayed is that it was an improvement. The development of agriculture is usually portrayed as a good thing. But there are advantages to foraging. For one thing, it provides a better balance of nutrients and, in particular, more protein, at least compared to the diet of the early farmers. Foragers end up eating a greater mix of foods, both plants and animals. But the early farmers, and to some extent this is still true today, the early farmers concentrated on just a few crops, like rice and wheat. There was less variety and therefore a smaller range of nutrients, and a lot more carbohydrates. So the quality of the diet wasn't as good. And we have evidence of this. In Greece and Turkey, when comparing skeletons from forager communities to those of early farming communities, we see that height declined when farming was adopted. Quite dramatically, I might add. Foragers were, on average, almost 15 centimeters taller than the early farmers. That's a lot. Furthermore, farming increased one's vulnerability to starvation. It was riskier to live off cultivated crops than to live off the wild, partly because it meant living off fewer plants. I mean, farmers, even modern farmers, only cultivate about 20 different plants on average. And even then, they really focus on just 3, wheat, rice, and maize. Modern foragers, on the other hand, depend on over 100 different plants, what with fruits, nuts, berries, roots, beans, and so on. So, if a few cultivated crops failed, if the rice crops failed, for example, the farmers were in trouble. Now, of course, wild plants could fail too, but foragers eat so many different plants, they'd always have something to eat. Also, domesticated plants may be more prone to failure than wild plants. Don't forget, agricultural crops are the result of selective breeding. Farmers choose certain seeds, ones that have the qualities they want, refining the crop each harvest. So, if seeds from the plumpest potatoes or the whitest rice grains are chosen, the hardier strains, the ones that can resist insect attacks or disease or extremes of temperature or moisture, for example, may be eliminated because the farmer hasn't chosen seeds from plants with these characteristics. So how did the switch from foraging to agriculture happen? Well, no one's really sure. Some speculate that during the final phase of the last ice age, about 10 to 13,000 years ago, there was a shift in climate in a number of locations that led to the decrease of food you could forage for. The failure of wild harvests may have caused people in different parts of the world to plant some crops to make up for the shortage. There's evidence that the practice of cultivation existed at that time. For example, rice was cultivated in China as long as 10,000 years ago by people who were also still eating wild rice. By counting the proportions of wild rice and cultivated rice in plant fossil remains, archaeologists have determined that the switch to farming there was a slow one, taking about 4,000 years. So it didn't happen overnight. And there's evidence that other groups of people also cultivated some cereal crops, blending both foraging and farming for thousands of years. So putting people in little boxes, classifying them as either foragers or farmers, well, we don't do that anymore. Of course, there were advantages to farming. Agriculture provided a greater quantity of food. And when you have an increasing population, as was the case in ancient southwestern Asia, that's a definite advantage. Also, with irrigation, crops could be planted in what was until then useless land. For example, wheat and barley didn't grow naturally on the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in ancient Mesopotamia. But once that land was irrigated, all of it could become cultivated. And hectare for hectare, farming yielded more food than foraging. Farmers needed 20 times less land, 100 times less if they irrigated, to feed the same number of people as foragers needed.
Question 1. What is the lecture mainly about? The correct answer is A. The relative advantages of foraging and farming. The professor talks about the switch from foraging, finding wild food, to farming, growing crops. She begins by saying that although the development of agriculture is usually considered a good thing, there are many advantages to foraging. She then discusses the benefits. After that, she says that no one knows for sure why the switch from foraging to farming happened, and talks a bit about how some cultures combined foraging and farming. Finally, she talks about the benefits of farming. So the lecture is mostly about the benefits of both foraging and farming. Question 2. In what ways was the forager diet preferable to that of the early farmer? It had greater variety. Answer A is correct. The professor explains that foragers ate a wide variety of foods, both plants and animals, which gave them a better balance of nutrients. Early farmers ate mainly a few crops, which did not give them as much variety or as many nutrients. Question 3. Why does the professor mention skeletons found in Greece and Turkey? Answer C. To contrast the difference in height between early farmers and foragers. The professor talks about skeletons from Greece and Turkey to show that foragers were taller than early farmers, about 15 centimeters. Question 4. According to the professor, what was a possible result of the selective breeding of crop plants? The correct answer is B. The plants became more vulnerable to disease. Selective breeding involves picking seeds with the best traits to improve the harvest. However, farmers tend to focus on qualities like size and appearance rather than factors like resistance to insects or diseases. As a result, the crops become more vulnerable to problems compared to wild plants. Question 5. What is the professor's attitude toward the classification of ancient people as either foragers or farmers? Answer D is correct. She believes that the evidence now indicates that the situation was more complex. The professor says it's too simple to classify people as just foragers or farmers. Many people did both for a long time. The change from foraging to farming was slow and complicated, so we can't put people into just one category. Finally, question 6. Why does the professor mention irrigation? Answer C. To support her point about farming providing a great quantity of food. The professor talks about irrigation, watering land, to show that farming can produce more food. She explains how irrigation helped ancient Mesopotamia grow crops where they couldn't before, making farming much more productive than foraging. That's the end of our lesson. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments how many points you got right in each lecture and in the reading passage, and which words were new for you. As always, I wish you all a stellar TOEFL score. Until next time, bye!